UKIP is challenging what it calls 5 key Euro myths about the economic consequences of being in the EU or out of it, saying that trade agreements with the rest of the world, for example, and the EU itself, would be more beneficial if this country were outside the European Union. The party's trade spokesman, William Dartmouth, MEP, is here, and we're also joined by Lucy Thomas, who's campaign director for Business for New Europe, which is in favour of continued British membership. Mr Dartmouth, could you just sort of sum up briefly, so that we don't waste too much time going through the details, sum up briefly what you think this economic myth is?
Well, I'd just like to highlight the fact of the sheer value of trade that takes place between non-EU countries and businesses and individuals in the EU. If you look at the value of the trade of just of the top 20 non-EU countries, it's more than the entire economy of France. It's more than the entire economy of the UK. China alone exported almost 280 billion euros to the EU in 2013, which is about 200 billion pounds. Switzerland, which is not a member of the EU, exported 4.7 times per capita than actually what we do. And that is what I would like to highlight. And the reason I'd like to highlight it is because of the myth of the 3 million jobs that would be lost when and if the UK leaves the EU is just that, a myth. And it's worse than that. It is a deceit, and people should stop peddling it. The facts simply don't support it. It's not a credible proposition.
Lucy Thomas.
I'm not sure why any of that explains why we should leave the EU just because other countries also trade.
Because you're selling fear, that's why.
Sorry, did I talk about any jobs or anything else?
Allow her to respond before you shout. Yeah.
I think the point is there's no explanation of why we should leave. We currently have the best of all worlds. We export almost 50% to the rest of the EU, and there are no barriers, no tariffs. It's all really straightforward. And so I'm not sure why we would want to take a risk and leave that, and also not know what any new deal would look like. There is no guarantee at all about what kind of standards there would be, what kind of tariffs. And actually, once were we to vote to leave, we have no say on the deal the rest of the EU decides to give us.
Mr Dartmouth.
Well, the basic point is this. All the trade would continue, and the trade is not dependent on there being a free trade agreement in any case, because five of the top 10 exporters to the European Union, there's no trade agreement. 11 of the top 20, there's no trade agreement.
But do you want
I would also point out to you that the EU has trade agreements. We make it 109, depends how you counted it, but it includes, for example, trade agreements with Mexico, South Korea, Colombia, Peru, South Africa,
which we benefit
Chile.
from.
And and it is just not credible that we don't need to have a trade agreement.
Do you actually want to rip up those trade agreements with over 50 countries around the rest of the world?
No.
We currently benefit from those whilst we're in the EU, and the free trade deals you talk about that Switzerland and Norway perhaps have with other countries, they're inferior trade deals. They're not as good as what we get negotiating as part of the world's largest market with 500 consumers versus 64 million in the UK. It's just not credible.
You don't need to have, first of all, you don't need to have a trade agreement in order to trade. And the underlying
tariffs and barriers.
You don't need to have a trade agreement in order to trade. China, the United States, and Russia have no trade.
Do you want tariffs and barriers? That's the question.
Sorry, can I complete my sentence, please? China, the United States and Russia have no trade agreement at the moment. But in practice, an EU-UK trade agreement is absolutely inevitable. And the reason is because we're running a massive deficit with the EU, which is probably not very good for the country. But in terms of negotiating a trade agreement, it's actually very, very good.
Do you think Do you think there are any advantages at all of being in the European single market?
Sorry?
Are there any advantages for this country at all?
The problem with the European single market. Yes, can I just tell you what the problem is? The problem is this: about less than 15% of our economy is accounted for by exports to the European Union. The figure we worked at is 14.3%. The problem is that over 85% of our economy is subject to EU regulation, and any manufacturer or any company exporting to, let us say, Japan follows Japanese rules without our entire economy being subject to Japanese regulation. And that's a very important point.
Okay, Lucy Thomas, just
but
on that.
So all of those regulations, they make it easier to export to the EU. One EU rule gets rid of 28 different rules all across the EU. So inevitably, in order to trade freely, you need to have one set of standards.
Well, the trouble is that our economy is actually hobbled by EU regulation. And my distinguished colleague, Professor Tim Congdon, has estimated these costs at 11% of GDP. The fact of the matter is that, let us say, we're sitting in here, there's the Langham Hotel opposite. Langham Hotel does not export to the EU, but it's nonetheless subject to EU regulation. The other problem with the single market is that after 25 years or whatever it is, it's still incomplete. It's only 80% complete as far as goods are concerned, and only 40% complete as far as services are concerned. And we put up with all this regulation.
Thomas, to respond, please.
But I'm afraid unless you comply with those rules, you're not going to be able to export your goods to the rest of the EU. So either you're like Norway and you copy and paste existing rules decided by the rest of the EU, you have zero say over them, or you're at the table, as we currently are, making the case for what we want those standards to be.
And
it's quite simple.
Lucy Thomas, William Dartmouth, MEP, thank you both very much.